Hello, my name is Zachary Siegel, and I'm a journalism fellow at Northeastern University's Health and Justice Action Lab. You're about to watch the second installation on changing the narrative. This episode is on drug courts, and here I interview Anne Giles, a therapist and clinician who has counseled a number of patients going through drug court treatment programs. Hope you enjoy this episode.
Substance use is generally perceived at best to be an immoral act of self-pleasuring. At worst, it is perceived as a crime. These are beliefs, however, not facts. Humans have used substances for 12,000 years. So use of substances is human. It's not immoral and it's not criminal. But beliefs about substance use have generated hundreds, thousands of laws about substance use and possession. Courtrooms and jails couldn't hold all the people arrested. Many of those incarcerated for drug-related charges were rearrested. So to address the high number of people in the legal system and high recidivism rates, an intermediate state was conceived, termed drug treatment courts. People arrested on drug-related charges would not be incarcerated, but would be mandated to treatment. The logic makes sense on some level. Requiring people who use substances to receive treatment would certainly seem likely to decrease the number of people in jails and prisons, and it should, in air quotes, fix those addicts so they won't be rearrested. The logic, however, is based on beliefs, not facts, about substance use. So that's how I'm seeing drug courts.
Yeah, so you're already getting into some of the very complicated cultural and philosophical views of drug use, and by definition, it being a criminal act lands people in the justice system, and so to get started with how are drug courts different from regular courts, and how do people how are drug courts sort of branded as like an alternative to incarceration? That seems to be um, one of the dominant media narratives, is that these are therapeutic alternatives to incarceration.
So before I begin, even one more piece is most of the people I have talked with who were part of founding drug courts had the best of intentions. They were trying to keep people with substance use issues out of jail, and they were trying to get them treatment, including medications. So I think there is a component of the foundation and formations of drug courts that had good intentions, had it was a good-hearted approach. The problem is that substance use disorder, substance use is a human act. So criminalizing substance use doesn't make sense. It criminalizes being human. That substance use is separated from substance use disorder, which is a medical condition. So why we would have any aspect of the legal system involved with treating a medical condition, there's a disconnect right there.
Right. I have one anecdote about exactly this. So I was at John Jay College in New York a while ago for a sort of conference seminar, and there was a drug court judge on one of the panels, and the drug court judge sort of went off on a tirade about why, quote unquote, Suboxone doctors are a racket in her community, and she hates when, um, her, I guess, clients or people who come before her in drug court are recommended to go on buprenorphine or Suboxone, and hearing just a completely anti-medical, totally unscientific view of this life-saving medication from a drug court judge was quite revealing. So this person, a judge, is making clinical and medical decisions that are life and death decisions for people who come before her. And so already we get into this zone of people who do not have the credentials and the background and the expertise making decisions about people who are in the system. So can you maybe talk about that a
Yes.
little
Yes, she has a premise, and her premise is based on a belief, not a fact. And the belief is that substance use is bad. Substance use is not to be done. It's a self-pleasuring act. And so any substance use is bad. So, but that is what we do though. Well, some substance use is bad, but others isn't. So, for instance, alcohol. We certainly, that is our beloved beverage that we use in public plentifully. And double the number of people in the United States die as a result of alcohol compared to opioids. But we don't get upset about alcohol. We get upset about opioids. And so how to get access to a drug court judge and then get access to a drug court judge's beliefs and to be heard by the drug court judge. Look, judge, here are the facts. They are not your beliefs are not consistent with facts. It's a very difficult problem.
Can you sort of walk us through how one might wind up in a drug court and then what kind of conditions are placed on them once they're in the system?
Well, if you, I've done lots of research on this, and so the idea is punish. It's like punishment light. No, punishment. Yeah, punishment light. Jail light. A freedom harsh. It's this, this sort of amorphous place where you're kind of getting punished, but you're kind of free at the same time. But you're only free to do a certain number of things, and the judge can arbitrarily tell you that what you've done isn't right. So it's sort of this gaslighting, no-win, catch-22 situation of stress and distress and anxiety, and constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. When am I going to get in trouble for me living my life as I've doing my best to do that? So I don't know if that addresses your question exactly, but here one has to be, one's attorney recommends it to the state attorney, and then the state attorney approves it or not, and then I think the drug court approves it. There's a drug court team, and the judge is on it, and then some amorphous people are on it. An indeterminate number of people with. It's just very quiet and very closed, and
Hmm. And
yeah, so I
so,
really can't speak authoritatively to how people get in drug court. They end up in it, and it's a plea, and they usually they have to sign a waiver saying they plead guilty, and they waive rights. There are some rights that they waive as well. So I'm not a legal scholar, and so I can't speak expertly or authoritatively on the subject.
right. Well, I mean, basically, someone obviously gets arrested for drug possession or some other arrest stemming from drug use or an ongoing addiction, and then instead of going to um, direct to punishment and incarceration, there's an alternative. We're going to bring you to a drug court where instead of going to prison, you might get mandatory drug testing, you might get mandated to an addiction treatment facility or some outpatient service. You might get mandated to doing community service, to doing counseling, and these are all sort of um, options other than prison and jail where people are diverted into these options. And then, but what happens if someone fails a drug test or doesn't go to counseling or whatever they agreed to do, their end of the bargain, what if they don't hold it up?
So based on my experience and my reading, and this is the most heinous piece. So substance use disorder is defined as continuing to use despite adverse consequences. So if I continue to use substances, that means that my brain is not working the way it's supposed to. The idea is if I put my hand on a hot burner, my brain is going to tell me to take it off. If I experience the adverse consequences of a third-degree burn, my brain takes it off. But if I put my hand on the burner and I don't take it off and it's burning away, that is a brain problem. And that is why substance use disorder is defined as a health condition involving the organ of the brain. So if I have persistent use despite adverse consequences, and I'm in the criminal justice system and it says, no use, I have a condition that makes use nearly impossible. I might be able to postpone it, but I can't not use. And so if the urine drug screen is just, an infinite negativity. But anyway, so I have to urinate in front of someone. It's an observed screen. And then if there are substances in my urine, that's considered a probation violation. I have a hearing, and I possibly could be incarcerated for a probation violation on top of my original charge. For an illness, for having the symptom of a health condition.
Hello? Yeah?
Yeah, are you there,
Yeah.
Zach? Yeah, I was pausing to
Oh, okay.
just think about how tragic this is.
Right. And so in the face of all this, given this is a sort of changing the narrative, a topic and something that we've decided to target and unpack and counter all the information that gets reported about this. And typically, like I was just sharing the screen for changing the narrative, that it's sort of taken as a given that drug courts simply work, or that these are a effective alternative to incarceration. And I want to bring up one um, piece that gets circled around quite often. So Time magazine published a piece by Newt Gingrich, of all people, and Van Jones. So Van Jones is a CNN commentator, and Newt Gingrich is the former Republican Speaker of the House. And they are part of a group called Advocates for Opioid Recovery. And they published a piece in Time magazine that basically the headline is drug courts can help solve the opioid crisis. And so they say rather than fill our prisons and jails with people who are addicted to drugs or who suffer from mental illness, Congress should look to proven solutions that promote accountability and treatment. One model that deserves more national attention is treatment courts, such as those for drugs and veterans' treatment. And so there are about 3,000 drug courts nationwide. And uh, can we talk about, well, we can talk about why Van Jones and Newt Gingrich are plugging them, which is strange, but also, what does the research say, and how strong is the evidence uh, for drug courts being a quote solution to the overdose crisis?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I think before any discussion has to begin on pretty much any topic, you have to define terms. So what do we mean by work? Drug courts work. If a medical treatment works and it's a research-based treatment, that means that it is helpful to most people most of the time, better than other things and better than nothing. That's what research offers us. It doesn't offer us, it offers us for groups and populations. It may or may not be effective for the individual at the individual level. And so a public health effort would be this treatment helps most people most of the time better than other things and better than nothing. That is absolutely not true about drug courts. It helps, it may, so, and we don't know if it helps. Some people claim that having been participants in drug court, their lives have, quote unquote, drug court saved my life. Well, this is not a research-based answer. We did not run an experiment and have the person go through treatment versus drug court or nothing versus treatment or drug court. We can't, there's no way to draw that conclusion. So research, and there's decades of research on drug courts. It doesn't help most people most of the time. And it also doesn't measure all entrants. If you measure all the people who come into drug court, they're violated and ejected from the program over and over again for various infractions. Poppy seeds. One is not allowed to eat poppy seed foods. So there's. It just reminds me, frankly, of 1984, of these sort of authoritarian regimes that come up with arbitrary standards to just keep people scared, under control and scared.
So in our audience is David Lucas, who has worked extensively in Toronto's drug court, and I believe he's in New York now, David. And he just said, there's a quote in the field, you've seen one drug court, you've seen one drug court, which is to say there are 3,000 of them, and they all have their own independent quirks, and they function differently. So it might even be hard for us to generalize what we mean when we're talking about drug courts as a whole, because they're not standardized. And what Lucas is saying is that the consequences for people in these systems can be dire, and that we're putting a lot of trust in elected actors to carry out what is essentially healthcare work. And so have you, Anne, ran into how sort of heterogeneous the drug court system is? Like, for example, are you aware that some courts allow people to be on drugs like methadone as treatment and some don't?
Exactly, and I just want to appreciate David Lucas for affirming that we have to define terms. Do we define what a drug court is? We don't even have that settled, and he's exactly right. They are so different. So, and the point you make is probably the key one about does a drug court allow people to be on medication for opioid use disorder? Are methadone and buprenorphine, which are the top treatments for opioid use disorder, allowed by the drug court? So the drug court usually does not have a medical professional on staff making a decision about whether or not the person is allowed to have buprenorphine or methadone. So it's considered a human rights violation to deny people medication that they've been prescribed and or have a medical illness for, that the medication is the standard of care. So that's allowed at all. Well, there's suits. There are suits in various states, primarily by the ACLU, to protest this.
So I'm going to share my screen real quick with a investigation by the New York Times. So if everyone can see it, it says, "Seizing on opioid crisis, a drug maker lobbies hard for its product." And there's an advertisement for what is the brand name for naltrexone. It's Vivitrol. And so this is one medication that drug courts apparently tend to favor, and this one is it's an antagonist, unlike buprenorphine and methadone, which are agonists, and basically all of the research points in the direction of methadone and buprenorphine, and Vivitrol, let's say, it doesn't perform as well as these other drugs, and it critically does not have the component of reducing fatal overdose deaths that methadone and buprenorphine do have. And so, Anne, have you looked into um, Alkermes, which is the company that manufactures Vivitrol? Have you looked into how they sort of gone into the drug court system, and what kind of marketing campaign they deployed to win the favor of people in the drug court system?
Yes, and there isn't much to say except they did that, and it is incorrect science. Now, Trexone locks receptors damaged by opioid overuse in their damaged state, relegating the person to suboptimal perception of pain and limited experience of positive feelings. Now, Trexone does not treat the problems of craving, withdrawal, or depression. It is contraindicated for patients with symptoms of depression. It may cause liver damage, contraindicated for substance use disorder patients with co-occurring hepatitis C. It is a suboptimal treatment. It should not be on the table.
Yeah, and as far as the marketing goes, what I've came to understand is that uh, the sales reps and the marketing campaign aimed at people in the criminal justice system who make decisions was basically that we are an alternative uh, to drugs like methadone and buprenorphine, and because Vivitrol is an antagonist, no one is quote getting high on Vivitrol, and there is no quote potential for abuse, and there's no potential for diversion, and I've reported sort of extensively about how buprenorphine gets covered in the media, and there's a lot of, as David Lucas is saying, there's a lot of panic around the diversion of drugs like buprenorphine. And because Vivitrol is an antagonist, there is no market, no one's selling their Vivitrol and things like that. And so basically, what this comes down to is the sales reps and the marketing campaign, um, and this is documented, exploited all of these panics and all this stigma around agonist medications to prop up their medication in the criminal justice setting.
Right, and this again is based on a piece of the narrative that is false. Back to substance use is bad. Well, NIDA, the National Institute for Drug and Alcohol Abuse, which is a stigmatizing term, has done research on why people use drugs, why they use substances. To feel good, to feel better, to do better, curiosity and social pressure, which is to feel connected. So humans choose highs. Even a cup of coffee can be a high. Sex is a high. Exercise is a high. What is our concern about pleasure in America? And there's all kinds of theories about this, but our founding by sort of religious anti-pleasure folks, we're still suffering from that. So, Maya Solovitz, the Surgeon General's report came out in 2016, in November 2016. To me, that is going to be in history books, that's going to be the difference between before and after. Because in 2016, before that, the media just was not covering anything. There just wasn't news about the research on addiction. So the Surgeon General's report comes out in 2016, and it says it's a medical condition. Here are the 3 things you do. You go to you get medical care through your primary care physician. There may be medications for what you have. If there isn't, you get a physical, and you get anything that's stressing you and draining you from below medically treated so that you feel better, because that's one reason people use drugs, to feel better or to not feel worse. Then it said, the Surgeon General's report says, individual counseling. Group counseling is not an evidence-based treatment for substance use disorder. Individual counseling might be. And then it says the third thing to do is to get support, and you might need some help getting access to social services. That is what treats addiction. And so before November, in June of 2016, Maya Solovitz wrote a letter to the New York Times, and in it she said, shame and stigma are the exact opposite of what treats addiction. And I tweeted her, and I said, well, what does fight addiction? And she wrote back, love, evidence, and respect. So those are the criteria I use when I talk about addiction policy and addiction law and drug courts. Is it underpinned? Is what we're doing underpinned by love, evidence, and respect?
Yes, and of course Maya Solovitz, one of the founders of Changing the Narrative, who really helped get us organized. I'll share my screen again. She wrote, being way ahead of the curve here. So can everyone see? So she wrote in 2015, How America Overdosed on Drug Courts. So I will pass around the link to this and everything else that everyone's mentioning. But just in the subhead, if everyone can see, the verdict is in. Drug courts, quote, embolden judges to practice medicine without a license, and they put lives in danger. And so for many years, and now notice we're in 2019, the narrative around drug courts is still very much so that they are effective, that they're an effective alternative. And I think, Anne, what you're saying is that, it's possible that if drug courts were held to better standards, if they were standardized at all, if they had medical experts involved in the decision making, and they didn't, hang charges over people's head, what I'm getting at is it sounds like there is a way that people, or that drug courts can be tooled and recalibrated to help people. Have you seen that, happen anywhere? Do you know any examples of this being done right?
I do not. However, I do know that there are people who are becoming aware of evidence-based treatment and are trying to advocate within drug courts to convince the sort of the legal system, the basic people, the drug court judges, to convince them that treatment would result in what they want. My understanding of what drug court judges want, they never want to see the person again, is a kind of how I've heard it said off the record. And so no recidivism. So how do we reduce recidivism? Well, it is if people are being arrested for possession and use, we can decrease use and possession with evidence-based treatment. There it is. You're exactly right. If drug courts would align themselves with what the evidence says, they are going to get the results that they seek. And the other piece, the other piece is, unless they do that, drug courts are in violation of constitutional, legal, and human rights principles. And Eighth Amendment, Americans with Disabilities Act, First Amendment rights, Fifth and 14th Amendment violations. It's they have to stop.
Right, so we're getting into a lot of the ethical and frankly legal issues that a lot of people have raised with drug courts, and of course people waive their right to a trial and they plea, and there's all sorts of problematic coercion going on in the very beginning to get people into drug courts. Someone in the chat shared this piece highlighting a judge uh, who was sort of praised for doing something different. And it looks here like the judge was urging defendants to obtain naloxone, which is admirable. I mean, I think something like that is really important. And I mean, I don't know how they got the people the naloxone. It looks like there's a local harm reduction group who provided it. So, it there's instances maybe where judges are warming up to harm reduction, but also in this same piece, it's clear that in this paragraph right here that uh, Narcotics Anonymous meetings were mandated, and if anyone knows anything about Narcotics Anonymous, that there is no doubt some stigma against medications like methadone and buprenorphine in those. So there's almost like a feedback loop where the courts stigmatize these medications and then mandate people to attend these meetings that stigmatize the medications. And so I can see someone who's caught up in this system sort of at every step being denied, refused, or medications, or hearing incredibly stigmatized and misinformed messages about these medications. So I see it as can be a pretty dangerous place for someone.
Yes. Yes, and naloxone, as lovely as it is so far downstream with a person with substance use disorder. A primary care physician visit, could we start there? Just to, even if you won't allow the medications, could they have a thyroid test? Could they have lab work? Could they have the boil on the bottom of their thigh removed that hurts every time they sit down? Geez. Yeah, so anyway, so it starts with medical care. That's what the research says, medical care. Naloxone is worst case scenario in an emergency. There's plenty of situations where it's not an emergency. At the beginning, medical care. So the challenge for me as a person who helps people with substance use disorder is many of my clients do not have health insurance. So I advocate for them to get physicals, and yet they don't have health insurance or the funds to pay for one. So I appreciated your point about the complexity. This is a complex set of problems with barriers. One solution one way is there's barriers other ways. So it's very, very complex, and that's why I keep seeking the sort of the guidance. So love, evidence, and respect. Those are reasonable places to start. Or even just with the science. What does the research say about what's helpful? Urine drug screens. The research does not support that these are helpful in people achieving their treatment goals.
Right. And so we're about, 40 minutes in, and there are people in the chat, and I
Just on
do
the
want
phone. I'm on the phone here.
I do want to open up um, the chat to anyone who wants to talk or talk about anything that's on their mind about this topic. One thing that I wanted to mention is because I'm a reporter and I consume a lot of media, and I'm sort of new in this role as like a media critic of this whole space. Um, so I saw a documentary on Netflix called Heroin, and that's spelled with an E, and it was nominated for an Academy Award. And one of the people profiled in that documentary was a drug court judge in West Virginia, and which is, as we all know, it's like considered ground zero or the epicenter of the opioid epidemic. And a lot of people who saw this documentary, it was their first time ever hearing about drug courts. It was the first sort of media representation that really caught national attention about drug courts. And so I just think, it's critical for all of us in this space to be looking, just outside of news and outside of research and into other representations in pop culture and entertainment about how drug courts are being talked about. And in this documentary, the drug court very much was shown in like a favorable kind of fawning light. And the drug court judge was portrayed as like, sort of like a stickler, like all judges, like throwing the book at people in one sense, but also being very compassionate and understanding of their plight. And so if anyone has any other um, comments or anecdotes or stories about how they've seen drug courts reported about in the news media or
Yeah.
how they've
Zach,
been.
can you hear me now? Zach?
Yes, yes.
Oh, hi. This is Ethan Nadelman. I've been listening to this, and it's fascinating, and I agree very much with Ann's take on what's fundamentally wrong with the whole drug court approach. But I've also been seeing David Lucas's comments about trying to turn the Toronto drug courts into a more harm reduction direction. And
Hmm.
so I think, as some of for Drug Policy Alliance, our battle with drug courts was a pretty fundamental one, where we battled over ballot initiatives in California, and we battled over their model, and we see their model as fundamentally flawed for lots of the reasons that Ann laid out. At the same time, right, there is this question about how one, given the reality of drug courts and the momentum and the difficulty of sort of turning that around anytime rapidly, and given the challenges of trying to advance harm reduction within a criminal or alongside a criminal justice context, I am very interested in learning more about the differences among drug courts. And there are some drug court judges, and I sent around that piece by Judge Lidger in New Mexico, who's trying to move things in a more harm reduction direction, given his limitations of options and his, knowledge of the broader area. Hence, he's recommending NA or AA or things like that, but I think he'd be aware of the need to do more. And he's been involved in conversations hosted by Open Society Foundation and DPA on decriminalization and such. But the other thing I wanted to say, and this is in a more confidential basis, without knowing
Sure.
exactly who's on the who's on the phone. Hold on one second. Um, I'm actually going to be going to NADCP's conference next week in Maryland.
Oh, great.
And I spoke there once 15 years ago on a plenary session, and kind of people were sort of screaming out, why am I different is, and this is confidentially speaking, the fellow who now heads NADCP, Carson
Hang on a second.
Fox.
This is recorded. You know this is recorded, right?
So
It,
I will edit
oh,
this
so I
out.
probably should be. So let me just put it carefully then. That I think there is interest, including among the leadership of NADCP, in how to move things in a direction that is more sympathetic to the basic evidence science harm reduction approach. And NADCP, of course, even as an organization, it's an organization that doesn't. I mean, it put out statements 15 years ago saying judges need to, allow methadone maintenance, buprenorphine as an alternative, and even 10 to 15 years later, 30 to 50% of judges don't do that, right? I think they're moving in the direction of saying that people should not be going to drug courts for simple drug possession offenses. Yet many drug court judges are simply that's what they're taking, right? And so, but there is some interest and growing interest within NADCP, including among some leadership, in how one begins to conform things more with science, evidence, harm reduction, da 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 da. And so, and I'll be speaking on a panel there, and I think I arranged for Judge Lidger from New Mexico to be there, and I'm trying to arrange for the head of NDCP to come, attend the Drug Policy Alliance biennial in St. Louis in October. So whatever is out there about what David Lucas mentioned in terms of how one does harm reduction vis-a-vis drug courts, how one, what are the small number of drug court judges who really believe in some core principles of the sort that people in this change in the narrative group do. I'd be fascinated to find out more about that, especially in the next few days and in advance of going down to this conference next week.
Yeah, I mean, it
Well,
definitely
I'm
sounds
really,
like David Lucas is your guy, given his experience turning around Toronto. So I hope you two can definitely connect
Yeah.
before you go into the lion's den at NADCP. And as far as confidentiality goes, Ethan, if you'd like, I can definitely cut out whatever because this is recorded and we want to throw it up online for anyone who missed it. I'm happy to cut out anything that
Yeah,
that
I think
you
I
wanted to stay.
think what I think what I said there was probably fine. Just in saying that there are people in NACP who are interested in moving in a direction more consistent with science, evidence, harm reduction principles. So
Well, that's good
hopefully
news.
that's fine. Yeah.
yeah. And Ethan, I really appreciate your participation and your question. And I have a tent by my desk, and next to me is I have written my clients here because they cannot speak for themselves. They dare not. They will violate probation. They will be found to violate probation. They will lose their children. They will lose their jobs. They will lose their licenses. They cannot speak. If they're in drug court, they dare not speak because we've just talked about the capriciousness of drug court judges about finances, relationships, and it's so I'm trying to think, what would my clients ask of the NADCP, and I think drug court judges, would you please just be self-interested? You will be praised if you have outcomes. And outcomes, we know what works, and treatment works. And you will have the lowest recidivism rates in the nation if you use evidence-based treatment, starting with medications and medical care for your participants. And so harm reduction begins immediately with medical care. And so I don't think attacking their beliefs is helpful. They believe substance use is bad. They believe it's immoral and criminal. However, enlightened self-interest says, I hear you believing that. Yes, but if you want praise for your outcomes, use evidence-based treatment.
hmm Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. I mean, it's also all sorts of things. I mean, take the example if somebody, just recently, for example, there was a drug court judge in Miami, one or two of them, who actually came out publicly in support of the legislation establishing needle exchange programs. And now I don't know how they talked about the contradiction inherent between what they do, because obviously, if somebody, one of their programs was seen going to a needle exchange program, that could be used as revocation of their, of their being an alternative program, and they might be reincarcerated. But you do see some of these who are looking to do more. Some of it can do how they drug test and what they're drug testing for, or whether they're ever willing to incarcerate people for testing positive, or there's those issues, right? The whole notion of using drug testing simply as an advisory rather than as for punitive purposes. Some of it may be about shifting the incentive system. What's the name of the treatment program that folks have done research on at Hopkins and others, where you offer positive incentives rather than sanctions for
Oh,
compliance?
Contingency management.
Contingency management. And I
Contingency
don't know if
management.
any drug courts are actually employing contingency management at this point. But that would be another good example. And if there are examples of drug court judges who are, that might be held as something that could be done.
Yes.
And even like lead, if you think about lead, right, is either the least coercive version of alternatives to the criminal justice system we have in America, or the closest thing to a Portugal model in America, given that it's in America, right? But you have drug court judges who are okay with lead and sympathetic to it as long as they don't see it as competing with them for funding. Right. And so, there's elements in which anyway, you can see the bigger thrust of this thing is how does one begin to identify and hold up people who are in drug courts who actually want to do the right thing, and where these judges can see among their peers models for operating in ways that would be more consistent with the evidence and with our beliefs.
mm.
You know.
Ethan, thanks for chiming in. Have you seen the Physicians for Human Rights report from 2017 on drug courts? I know DPA has a great one too.
Yeah, no, I did see that. I have to review that and some others before I go down. I got to take a look at
Yeah,
Maya's book and things like that. But and I do remember it. Yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah, definitely a report back from that meeting. We'd love to hear how it goes down.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. No, there's actually a funny overlap between Physicians for Human Rights and Drug Policy Alliance now, where my former communications director is the communications director at Physicians for Human Rights. My former deputy director is now the acting policy director there. So they're definitely thinking along the right lines on this type of stuff. Yeah.
Well, it's really good
Yeah, and
news.
Ethan, I really appreciate you mentioning funding because I think that is another possibility is if citizens advocate for unfunding drug courts until they offer evidence-based treatment and do not violate rights, that could be important as well. And, I advocate for citizens to go to drug court hearings and watch what happens because that they will see citizens, residents, Americans having their rights violated right there and getting legal sanctions without an attorney present. I
Hmm.
also
So,
invite people to go to their, go ahead.
oh, I was just saying along those lines, the Brooklyn Defenders, they're a excellent Twitter account, and Dr. Rebecca J. Kavanaugh, I recommend everyone follow her. What she does is goes to bond court and goes to hearings and just live tweets all the cases that get brought up in Brooklyn's court, and it produces outrage and is really a great public service because people, especially journalists, they don't go to those courts anymore and no one's really there to sit around and watch the daily grind of these machines. So any sort of effort to go to these hearings, to share with people who can't go what they look like and what kind of decisions are being made, all of that, just broadcasting the everyday nature of these places is a critical service.
Yeah, and for people who can't go to drug court hearings, they can go to their state attorney's office and ask for the drug court handbook. It is the drug court handbook that I think is the place that's going to open this up. And to take that drug court handbook to an independent medical professional and an independent attorney and ask them if they meet the standard of care for medical care and if they violate constitutional, legal, and/or human rights, and getting an independent analysis of the content of the drug court handbook, then a citizen can go to the legislative body that funds the drug court and say, why are you doing this? Why are you funding a program that violates medical standards of care and/or constitutional, legal, and/or human rights? It's a thing.
And I mean along those lines, like why Newt Gingrich and Van Jones are sort of doing PR for drug
Well,
courts.
I mean, the issue there
That's
with, I mean, Van should know better. I mean, part of it is it's a generic problem of people who are doing sort of progressive criminal justice reform, oftentimes being deeply uninformed
yeah,
about harm reduction and drug policy and drug addiction treatment. And I've talked with Van over the years about some of this stuff, but not in any detail. And, part of this is just not knowing better. Part of this may have to do with, with a kind of personal sympathy for abstinence-only approaches that is not necessarily, on his part, which I don't know if that's actually true, but I know that his heart's in the right place, but I think other things may be, lack of awareness and other variables may be causing him to support things without knowing better. I mean,
sure.
Newt Gingrich is a different story because he comes from a more
Yeah,
coercive Republican background. Yeah.
yeah. But it is fascinating for people, just like for someone like me, casually observing things, and then to see some strange bedfellows pop up and be on the
Well, I
same
mean,
side.
obviously the Van Newt Gingrich collaboration is because they are, working together, as is ACLU and Koch Foundation and a whole range of other players on
Right.
criminal justice reform and ending mass incarceration. So that's the origins of that relationship. But it's when you get into the details and how one thinks about diversionary programs, or how one thinks about decriminalization, or how one thinks about treatment, that you really run into, and that's a persistent problem, and it exists not just the criminal justice reform field, it exists among the major foundations that are funding criminal justice reform. It exists because of people's unease around what decriminalization and the basic notion of not incarcerating people for, possessing or using substances in the absence of harm to others. Those sorts of personal resistance among people who are otherwise liberal or right-minded has been a persistent problem for, that helped contribute to the support for the drug war in the early years, and that actually helps to retard reform in these days today.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating discussion, and a whole other can of worms. We should definitely
Yeah.
continue on one day and
Well, I
revisit
know
that.
we're just about out of time, and so
Mhm.
the final can of worms, or the last myth that I want to debunk and hope that journalists who are trying to change the narrative, or at least report on it actively, will understand that punishment does not treat addiction. Punishment does not treat any medical illness. That has to be off the table. And my position is that the data is overwhelmingly against drug courts, that they should be eliminated. There should be no proliferation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. I mean, if the evidence, if facts and evidence were alone to change policy, we could pack up our bags and go home.
Right,
So,
exactly.
Well
Anyway,
put.
thank you.
Well
But this
put.
is, I just have to sign off. But thank you very much, Zach and Ann. I really, really appreciate the discussion. And if David's still on, let's follow up as soon as possible.
yeah, I
Okay.
can definitely connect you to offline, and absolutely
Okay.
good luck at the conference. And you did a fantastic job. Thank you so much for taking the time out to be an engaged, changing the narrative participant. Thank you for researching to death these topics that you care about. And thanks for being a voice for your clients, and for speaking for people who, like you were saying, really don't have a voice. So that really means a lot.
And it means a
And
lot to me, Zach, that you're doing this too. Thank you.
Yes.
and this
Thank
is
you.
Leo.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. This was really fascinating.